limestone brought by water from near Stamford. The Norman gate was in front of the west door of the Abbey church. Here it is in a recreation of the original grid plan. But if we preserve ancient plans in today's towns, other pleasures are lost. I should have liked to drive down this street with the gate tower always in view. But life is full of little perversities, and one is that this street, like many in Bury, is one way, but one way up. Here it is, close to, and though no longer embattled as it was originally, this is one of the very grandest of the Norman gate towers. The gatehouses are faced with limestone, which had to be imported. This was expensive, but the church could afford it. And in 1353, when the abbey needed stronger defences, a second gatehouse was built into the precinct. This is known as the Abbey Gate, and is on Angel Hill. It's a glorious building, at once strong and exquisitely enriched, one of Bury's most treasured possessions. Bury has another survivor from the great days of the Abbey, a stone house built in or about 1180. This house is called Moyses Hall, and as we can see, the two windows below the clock still retain their original Norman arches. The exterior, it's true, was badly mishandled in the Victorian period, especially by the addition of that ridiculous turret. But within, it's much better preserved. What is most remarkable is that the ground floor rooms in this house are stone vaulted. The two massive Norman piers with cushioned capitals are very unusual in a private house. Surviving Norman houses in England are very few. Several of them are associated with Jews, at Lincoln, for example. Perhaps because Jews were often moneylenders, so needed what were, in a sense, their own private strongholds. The front of Moyses Hall is faced with Bury's only local stone, which is flint. It usually looks better when it has been knapped, that is, split to reveal its shiny interior. That's how it was used here, in combination with limestone and narrow red bricks to form the central feature of the front of the old medieval Guildhall. The wings were refronted in 1807. The centre has enjoyable flint and stone chequer work and a pretty carved escutcheon bearing the borough's coat of arms, a delightful embellishment of about 1760. But the domestic buildings here were for hundreds of years almost all timber-framed. Even after Bury's Great Fire of 1608, the principal material was still wood. Even the one house that Celia Fiennes admired here when she visited the town in 1698 is timber-framed. Cupola House, as it's called, after its attractive top-knot, a fashionable feature at that time, had been built just 5 years before for a rich apothecary. Otherwise, Miss Fiennes was not impressed with Bury's houses. Though there are a great deal of gentry here, she recorded, there are no good houses, but only what are old and rambling. What is obvious is that the large majority of Bury's timber-framed houses are rendered. Celia Fiennes also refers, perhaps a trifle condescendingly, to timber houses of the old form, with high-peaked roofs of tiling. And this, no doubt, was one of them. One, moreover, that escaped the fire. This was an early Tudor hall house, by which is meant that in the centre there was a hall which originally went right up to the roof. Here we have a true example of Suffolk pink. It's a sort of peach pink, but the colour varies a little, and the further away it gets from strawberry ice cream, the better. Here's a building which is very instructive if you're interested in windows. Each time the eye moves upwards, it retreats a century. The shop window is early Victorian and a very pleasant example. The first floor windows are Georgian, complete with their glazing bars. And then on the second floor are the casement windows with leaded lights, which no doubt the whole house had when it was first built. Now here's something very different. This one would make us laugh, were it not for the really dreadful fascia board. For this shop, which used to be Boots the chemist's, bursts forth upstairs into a glorious riot of mock half timbering and ornamental stucco work, which only the Jacobeans and the Victorians would have dared to perpetrate. And this, of course, is late Victorian. Elsewhere, it isn't always a good idea to look up. This horrid pebble dash is definitely not right for Berry. This shop is a timber frame building which preserves, marvellous to say, its carved corner post, now happily protected from the risk of further decay. Inside are robust oak roofs, here and there enriched with bratishing. This is a moulding also quite often found on Gothic church screens. There's a restored Jacobean staircase too, with lovely newel posts. And upstairs, a striking tie-beam roof with crown posts. A framed building like this one was prefabricated. Each joint was carefully marked in the carpenter's yard, so that the right mortises could be fitted over the correct tenons. Some of the axe marks can actually be seen here. This shop, admirably maintained, must be one of the most beautiful in England. In addition to all this, it has at the side onto Whiting Street a handsome Doric porch. I can't think of any other English town that has managed to preserve so many shop fronts which are a real pleasure to look at. Architecturally speaking, the great event of the 18th century was, here as in so many other English country towns, the arrival of brick. The first memorable building in this material is a most surprising one, the Presbyterian Chapel, now Unitarian, built in 1711 in the reign of Queen Anne. Apart from patches of modern repointing that make you weep, this nonconformist chapel is of quite unusual distinction. The brickwork is of very fine quality, in 2 shades of red. Bury was now becoming extremely prosperous. In 1730 came this. The stately town house, would you say, of some grandee, with his coat of arms in the pediment? Not at all. This was an almshouse, the Clopton Asylum, situated in the Abbey grounds. Today it's the home of the Provost of the Cathedral, and is known as the Provost's House. But the leading West Suffolk families were building fashionable townhouses in Bury all through the 18th century. These houses, we notice, are all predominantly red brick. But by the end of the 18th century, that colour was no longer in fashion. And if you could build in what was euphemistically called white brick, which was really dun-coloured or some shade of brown, you generally did so. In order to make bricks of these colours, it was necessary to find clay with a good deal of lime in its composition and no or very little iron. For it's iron that causes most bricks to emerge from their kilns some sort of red. In this house in St. Mary's Square, red bricks were still used for the dressings, but the main walling is brown. But here are some, all dating from the early years of the 19th century, which show no reds at all. Not every part of England has the right clays for this, but at Bury there was no problem. Builders didn't even have to look to the galt clays of Cambridgeshire, for in the Suffolk chalk around Woolpit, a few miles to the east, there were Pleistocene clays which were equally suitable. Here we see the colour the bricks would have been originally, for this house has recently been cleaned, and the colour may be truer, but the surface is scratched and damaged, and the bricks are probably now more porous. This one is so smothered with Virginia creeper that in summer one can hardly see what colour the bricks are. Here's a handsome pair, which effectively illustrate the pros and cons of creepers. I know which I prefer, but then I happen to care about architecture. In passing, notice the plaque on number 2, one of a number in Bury, which are quite tantalizingly uninformative. Louis Philippe. Yes, but what did he do here? Have a cup of coffee? We're not told. Now, all these handsome houses tell their own story. Bury had clearly become a highly flourishing social centre. Even in 1723, Defoe had described it as thronged with gentry, people of the best fashion and the most polite conversation. Probably assembly rooms were first opened here about 1713. This building, the Athenaeum, was re-edified in 1789 and altered again 15 years later. The changes involved the removal of the top story and the addition of the portico. But inside there is a most elegant ballroom with delicate stucco decoration on the vault, and along one side a nicely contrived columned recess for the band. But of course, the great feature is this double staircase. This is one of Bury's most enjoyable buildings, and no wonder, for the architect who reconstructed it between 1774 and 1780 was none other than Robert Adam. It was designed as a market hall with a small theatre above. The plan is cruciform, with each arm culminating upstairs in a Venetian window under a pediment. The material is white brick, here used in combination with limestone, which was always something of a luxury at Bury. The one post-medieval building which did have its whole front faced with limestone was the old prison, now known as the fort. Only the facade now survives, but that's a wonderful sight. This is formidable architecture. It must surely have had a severely deterrent effect upon intending criminals. Yet today there's nothing behind it. The architect, George Byfield, was no doubt inspired by George Dance the Younger's Newgate Jail in London. The date is 1803. This is Ketton stone, brought all the way from Rutland in flat-bottomed barges, down the Welland, across the Wash, and up the Ouse into the Lark, of which it is a tributary. Ketton stone sometimes has blushes of pink, as can be seen here. There are no shell fragments interspersed. This stone is commonly said to be the most perfect of all the oolites. We can see the composition here, with these very fine egg-like structures, rather like a herring's roe. Just look at these marvellous joints. It would be difficult to find stone masonry today as good as this. The centre is both rusticated and vermiculated. Vermiculation is the term used when the surface of the stone is dressed to suggest the tracks of worms. Rustication involves recessed joints, and therefore shadows, which induce a feeling of strength. In 1819 came the Theatre Royal, designed by William Wilkins, architect of the National Gallery. The exterior is pleasantly unmemorable. But within, we have one of the most agreeable early theatres in the country. After falling into disuse and being used by the neighbouring brewery for the storage of beer barrels, it had a miraculous resurrection. In 1965, it was reopened as a theatre with comfortable modern seating. This is a rare example of a late Georgian playhouse with pit and boxes and gallery. All most agreeable, unless, of course, you have the misfortune to get a seat behind one of those iron columns. It now belongs to the National Trust and provides a thriving cultural centre to the town. Bury's commercial prosperity was symbolised by the Corn Exchange, which is mainly of so-called white brick, but has a very imposing Ionic portico in, I think, Bath stone. The date is 1861-62, a time when people were somewhat prone to inscribe past quotations on friezes and elsewhere. Hence, here, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. In the surrounding countryside, farming is still the principal occupation, as it has been for centuries. Since the early part of the 19th century, Bury itself has expanded, in recent years considerably, and has become, inevitably, much more of a working town than it used to be.
Extra large funnel, 3 for 60. First quality, 3 for 60. Well, I love.
The chief places of employment are now in the brewery, in the sugar beet factory, and in county and local government. The Victorian brewery dominates the west side of what would otherwise be the town's most attractive square, St. Mary's. The sugar beet factory dates from 1924. This is well away from the historic town, so does no serious harm visually. On Angel Hill, a very sensitive site, are the Borough Council's offices, built in 1936. Here, in my view, neo-Georgian is acceptable. The building is uninspired, but at least well behaved. The health centre is luckily less conspicuous, but little else can be said in its favour. It's now a real pleasure to turn to the cathedral. When the new diocese of St. Edmunds, Bury and Ipswich was created in 1913, the Church of St. James was accorded cathedral rank. But for this, it was by no means large enough. Few problems are more difficult for an architect than to extend harmoniously an old church. At Bury, the job was given to Stephen Dykes Barr, who began work in 1959. The project isn't yet complete. In particular, it is hoped one day to have a lofty central tower and spire. Within, there's much to enjoy, and happily, no attempt has been made to be self-consciously modern. The east windows mainly consist of very acceptable Victorian glass by Kemp, from the side windows of the former chancel. The new masonry, which is mostly Dolting limestone from Somerset, has yielded a quartet of splendid arches at the crossing. The light fittings, always a teasing problem, are delicate and unobtrusive, and seem to me just what is required. The iron screens, painted red and blue, silver and gold, are completely original. The panels, believe it or not, were grills for underfloor heating, retrieved by the architect from a Victorian church near Manchester. Their reuse here is completely successful. The panelled and painted roofs have a tapestry quality. The outcome is an interior which is at once lively and dignified, a cathedral of which the diocese can be really proud, and surely an excellent example of the way to convert a parish church into a cathedral. For some people, Bury St Edmunds is now growing larger than they would like to see it. But happily, conservation conscious it still is. A day would hardly suffice to relish all the good things which this town still has to offer. But the historic centre must be explored on foot, and that's the only way